After a brutal accident, the Mafia boss was dying in the emergency room. The monitors were screaming, a frantic, mechanical pulse that echoed the panic in the air. "He's OH negative," a resident yelled, but the senior surgeon turned pale. "No, look at the cross-match. It's Bombay phenotype. We don't have a single unit in the state." Kenji Sato, the man whose name turned the city's blood to ice, was now a man whose own blood was failing him. The ticking clock on his life was down to 40 minutes. Dr. Alina Hamilton stood in the shadows of the trauma bay, her scrubs stained and her heart racing. She knew that blood type. She carried it in her own veins, a biological miracle and a curse. Without a word, she stepped forward, rolling up her sleeve. She wasn't asking for money or a favor or a seat at the table of a criminal empire. She was simply a nurse with the only key to his survival. As the first drop of her blood began to flow into the tube, the air in the room shifted. A silent tether was formed between the healer and the hunter, a bond that would soon ignite a slow-burning fire neither was prepared for. If you love stories where a single act of kindness can change a giant's heart, hit that like button and subscribe to our pack right now. And before the fire starts, tell us in the comments, which city or country are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? The emergency room was a symphony of chaos, but Dr. Alina Hamilton was the silence at its center. When Kenji Sato was wheeled in, his body broken from a high-speed accident that looked more like an execution attempt, the staff moved with frantic desperation. He wasn't just a patient. He was a shadow that loomed over the city's docks and boardrooms, a man whose reputation for cold efficiency preceded him. "He's crashing," the head surgeon barked, staring at the empty blood bags. "Where is the Bombay unit? I was told we had one on standby." "The courier is stuck in the flood downtown, doctor," a nurse replied, her voice trembling as she checked the digital log. "We have 20 minutes, maybe less, before his organs begin to fail. He's bleeding out internally." Alina stood by the sink, the cold water numbing her hands. She looked at Kenji. Stripped of his tailored suit and covered in road rash and dark, intricate tattoos of crashing waves, he looked strangely fragile. Most people in this city saw a monster, a kingpin of the underworld. Alina saw a man whose ticking clock was running out of seconds. She thought of her medical oath, and then she thought of the rare, golden secret she carried in her own veins. "I'm a match," Alina said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The room went silent. The surgeons traded looks of pure disbelief. The odds of two people with the Bombay phenotype, the rarest blood type on Earth, being in the same room were millions to one. It was a statistical impossibility, yet here she was, standing in the fluorescent glare of the trauma bay. "Dr. Hamilton, you've been on a double shift for 16 hours, the surgeon argued, his eyes darting to the monitors. "You're already exhausted. If you donate now, you're putting yourself at risk." "I can do it," she interrupted, already sitting in the donor chair positioned directly beside his gurney. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask about his criminal record or the body count associated with his name. "Hook us up. Now, we don't have 10 minutes to debate my vitals." As the needle entered her vein, Alina felt the familiar, heavy pull of life leaving her body. She watched the dark red liquid travel through the clear plastic tubing, bridging the physical gap between her world and his. She wasn't thinking about the favors a mafia boss could grant or the wealth he possessed. She was thinking about the fragile rhythm of a heart that refused to stop. But as the first unit of her blood began to stabilize him, Kenji's hand reflexively gripped the side of the metal bed. His fingers, cold and scarred, brushed against her forearm. A spark of something electric and terrifying traveled up her spine. In that moment, she wasn't just giving him a medical treatment, she was giving him a piece of her soul. The clock had slowed, but the story had just begun. The immediate crisis had passed, but the air in the private wing was thick with a new kind of tension. Kenji had been moved to a high-security suite, one guarded by men in charcoal-gray suits whose eyes never stopped scanning the shadows. Despite her bone-deep exhaustion, Alina found she couldn't leave. She told herself it was a matter of medical observation, that she needed to monitor the patient for a rare transfusion reaction, but the truth was more complex. She felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the man whose heart was now beating with her help. He woke up at 3 a.m. There was no gradual return to consciousness, no grogginess or confusion. His eyes, sharp and dark as obsidian, snapped open and found hers immediately. It was the gaze of a man who lived in a world where waking up slowly could be fatal. "Who are you?" he rasped. His voice sounded like stones grinding together, raw and dangerous. "Your doctor," Alina replied calmly, adjusting the IV drip. "And as of 4 hours ago, your donor. You have a very rare way of dying, Mr. Sato. It took a miracle to keep you here." Kenji's gaze drifted to the plastic tubing still connecting his arm to the stand, then back to Alina. He scanned her face with a terrifying intensity, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the steady set of her shoulders. "A doctor who gives her own blood to a man like me," he whispered. "What is the price, Dr. Hamilton? Protection? Money? A debt you need erased from the books?" Alina met his stare without flinching. She had seen men like him before in the trauma unit, men who believed everything in the world had a price tag. "The price is that you stay alive long enough to be discharged from my hospital," she said firmly. "I don't trade in favors or underworld debts, Mr. Sato. I trade in heartbeats. Right now, yours is the only one I care about." A small, grim smile, the first ghost of humanity she had seen on his face, tugged at the corner of his mouth. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Then you are the most dangerous person I've ever met," he said softly, his voice dropping an octave. "Because everyone wants something, and a man who owes a debt he cannot pay is a man who has lost control." As she reached over to check his pulse, her fingers brushed against his wrist. The contact was brief, but the slow burn of their connection was undeniable. For the first time in her career, Alina felt the professional wall she had built around her heart begin to crack. She was the healer, and he was the hunter, but in the silence of the hospital night, the lines between them were starting to blur. Days bled into a week, and the sterile walls of the hospital began to feel less like a clinical ward and more like a sanctuary. Kenji's recovery was unnaturally fast, fueled by a sheer, stubborn will that Alina had never witnessed in a patient. During the quiet hours, the slow burn intensified. He didn't speak of the violence of his world. Instead, he watched her work with a silent, intense focus. He asked about her favorite books and noticed the small, weary sigh she gave at the end of a long shift. For a moment, it felt like the love nest was forming in the most unlikely of places. However, the fragile peace was shattered when Alina arrived for her morning rounds to find the private wing in a state of suppressed panic. Kenji's usual guards were gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that made the hair on her arms stand up. She pushed open the door to his room and stopped short. The medical monitors had been shoved aside, and a glass vase lay shattered on the floor. Kenji was sitting on the edge of the bed, his chest bare, the white bandages over his ribs stained with a fresh, blooming crimson. "You need to leave, Alina," he said, his voice cold and flat. He didn't look at her, his eyes were fixed on the door. "The accident that brought me here, it wasn't a malfunction. It was a deliberate strike. And now the people who sent that message know that a doctor, a woman with rare blood, is the only reason I'm still breathing." "I'm not leaving my patient," Alina said, her voice shaking but her resolve firm. She stepped over the broken glass, reaching for a clean dressing kit. "You're bleeding again, Kenji. If you tear those stitches, the transfusion was for nothing." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was firm, a reminder of the lethal strength he possessed, yet he was careful not to bruise her. "You don't understand how my world works," he rasped, finally meeting her eyes. "They don't see your act of mercy as a noble deed. They see my blood in your veins and yours in mine as a weakness they can exploit. To them, you aren't a savior. You're a target I can't afford to protect." Alina looked down at his hand on her wrist, the contrast of his scarred skin against her own. The ticking clock of the medical emergency was over, but a new, more dangerous timer had begun. "Then let them come," she whispered. "I've spent my life in the middle of trauma and chaos, Kenji. I'm not afraid of the dark, and I'm certainly not afraid of you." Kenji was discharged under the cover of a moonless night, but he didn't return to the sprawling estate that served as his public fortress. Instead, he took Alina to a place known only to a handful of his most trusted men, a minimalist structure of glass and dark stone hidden deep in the coastal hills. It was a love nest, surrounded by high-definition security and the crushing silence of the wilderness. As she tended to his wounds in the quiet of the safe house's library, the slow burn of their relationship reached a fever pitch. There were no grand declarations of love, only the heavy, meaningful silence that filled the space between them. Alina noticed the way his gaze followed her every movement, and Kenji watched as she began to anticipate his pain before he even had to mention it. They had become synchronized, their rhythms dictated by the blood they now shared. "Why did you really stay?" he asked late one night, the flickering firelight dancing in his dark eyes as she changed his bandages. "It wasn't just the medical oath, Alina. You have a secret. I can see it in the way you look at the scars on my back, like you're searching for a map." Alina paused, her hands hovering just inches from his shoulder. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt out of place in the stillness of the room. She thought about the old, faded photograph tucked into the hidden compartment of her wallet, the one of her father, a brave dock worker who had vanished into the shadows 20 years ago. She thought about the persistent, ugly rumors of the Sato family's involvement in the disappearances at the harbor. "We all have ghosts, Kenji," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling wood. "I'm just making sure mine don't catch up to you before you're strong enough to face them." Kenji reached back, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt through her, a reminder of the life she had fought so hard to preserve. For a moment, the danger of the outside world vanished, leaving only the two of them tied together by a history neither fully understood. The safe house felt less like a hideout and more like a sanctuary as the days passed. Kenji began to show Alina a side of himself the world never saw, a man who played the cello in the dark and remembered the name of every person who had ever shown him a shred of loyalty. He was no longer the cold ghost of the city. He was a man piecing himself together, and he was doing it with her by his side. One evening, as the fog rolled off the ocean and swallowed the cliffs, Kenji presented Alina with a gift. It was a small, antique medical kit from the 19th century, made of polished rosewood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "For the woman who asks for nothing," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "A tool for the hands that saved me." Alina felt a lump in her throat as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. But as she opened the kit to inspect the glass vials and silver instruments, her breath hitched. Tucked into the velvet lining of the lid was something that didn't belong to the 19th century. It was a gold signet ring, worn thin with age, with a distinct crest of an anchor wrapped in ivy. The room suddenly felt ice cold. Alina's heart stopped, then began to hammer against her ribs with a violent force. She recognized that ring instantly. It was the only thing her father never took off, the ring he was wearing the night he kissed her forehead and walked out of their house, never to return. The hidden identity she had been nursing in the back of her mind shattered into a million pieces of reality. The man she had saved, the man whose heart beat with her very blood, was holding the key to her greatest tragedy. She didn't scream or run. She simply stood there, clutching the rosewood box until her knuckles turned white, the silence in the room becoming a heavy, suffocating weight. "Where did you get this, Kenji?" she asked, her voice a ghost of itself, trembling with 20 years of suppressed grief. "This ring belonged to a man named Marcus Hamilton. He was my father, and he disappeared the same year your family took over the docks." Kenji didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath and stepped into the light, finally ready to reveal the truth that had been 20 years in the making. Kenji did not turn away. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering firelight as he watched the realization wash over Alina. The midpoint reversal was complete. The story was no longer about a nurse saving a stranger. It was about a debt that spanned generations. "Your father did not disappear because of a crime, Alina," Kenji said, his voice dropping to a low, steady frequency. "He disappeared because he was protecting mine. My family didn't destroy him. He was our greatest ally." Alina's hand shook as she held the signet ring. "He was a dock worker, Kenji. He had nothing to do with the underworld." "That is what he wanted you to believe," Kenji replied, taking a step closer. "When I was a boy during the first great purge of the Sato clan, my father was betrayed. I was the only one left, a child with a target on my back. Your father, Marcus, was the one who hid me in the belly of those ships. He kept me fed, he kept me quiet, and he kept me alive for months." He paused, a shadow of old pain crossing his face. "When the rival families finally closed in, they didn't find me because your father refused to speak. He died so that I could live to reclaim my name. I have spent 20 years looking for his daughter, not to cause her harm, but to find the one person in this world I truly owed. I didn't expect her to be the woman who would one day pull me back from the edge of the grave with her own blood. The revelation felt like a tectonic shift beneath Alina's feet. The blood she had given him wasn't just a medical miracle, it was a generational circle closing. She hadn't saved a monster. She had saved the boy her father had sacrificed everything to protect. The hidden identity was no longer a threat. It was a bond forged in sacrifice long before they had ever met in that trauma bay. "He never told me," Alina breathed, her eyes blurring with tears as she looked at the ring. "He just told me to always be brave." "He wanted you to be the healer, Alina," Kenji whispered, his hand reaching out to steady her. "Not the victim. He wanted you to have a life where you didn't have to know the weight of a signet ring." The peace of the safe house was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the low, rhythmic thrum of black-on-black helicopters cutting through the fog. The rival faction had finally tracked them down. In the world of the Mafia, a love nest was never truly invisible. It was just a temporary reprieve. The ticking clock returned, but this time it wasn't a medical monitor. It was the security perimeter alarm. "They've bypassed the outer gates," Kenji said, his voice instantly reverting to that of a commander. He didn't panic, but his movements were stiff. The internal damage from the accident was still healing, and every sharp movement was a gamble with his recovery. "We have exactly 8 minutes before they reach the main house," Kenji stated, checking his watch. "Alina, there is a path through the sea caves. My men will meet us at the extraction point on the cliffs." "You can't walk that far, Kenji," Alina argued, already grabbing her rosewood medical kit. "Your sutures haven't fully scarred. If you push yourself, you'll bleed out before we see the ocean." "Then I'll bleed out," he replied, his eyes burning with a fierce protectiveness. "But I won't let them take the woman who carries my life in her veins." They moved through the darkened hallways, the emergency red lights casting long, eerie shadows against the glass walls. The physical toll on Alina was starting to show. The massive blood donation from days prior had left her iron levels low, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But as Kenji threw his arm over her shoulder for support, a strange synergy took over. They moved as one, the healer and the hunter, bound by a history they had only just uncovered. Every second that ticked by was a heartbeat stolen from the enemy. They weren't just running for their lives, they were running to protect the legacy her father had died to start. The slow burn of their romance had forged into a steel-hard loyalty as they descended into the cold, damp darkness of the caves, the sound of pursuit echoing like thunder behind them. The damp air of the sea caves finally gave way to the sharp, salty spray of the open ocean. A sleek, matte-black yacht waited at the edge of the jagged rocks, its engines humming a low, steady promise of escape. Kenji's men moved with tactical precision, covering the retreat as Alina helped a pail, sweating Kenji onto the deck. As the boat lurched forward, cutting through the dark waves and leaving the burning safe house behind, a collective sigh of relief filled the cabin. The pursuit had faded into the distance. The ticking clock of the extraction had hit 0, and they were still breathing. "We made it," Kenji rasped, sinking into a leather banquette. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled Alina toward him. "You're safe, Alina, it's over." For a moment, Alina allowed herself to believe it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, listening to the rhythm of the heart she had fought so hard to keep beating. They had survived the Mafia onslaught, they had escaped the shadows. It felt like the ultimate victory. But as she shifted her weight, she felt a strange, warm dampness on her arm. She pulled back, her eyes widening as she looked at her white scrub jacket. It was stained with a fresh, spreading bloom of dark red. "Kenji, stay still," she commanded, her voice turning clinical as she tore open his shirt. The victory was a lie. The grueling trek through the caves and the climb up the rocks had been too much. One of the deep, internal surgical stitches had burst, and because of his rare blood type, his body wasn't clotting fast enough. He was hemorrhaging internally, and they were miles from the nearest hospital, trapped on a boat in the middle of a Black Sea. The false victory had led them into a new, even more desperate trap. The cabin of the yacht, once a symbol of escape, had transformed into a makeshift operating room. The false victory had left them vulnerable, and the ticking clock was no longer a sound in the room, it was the fatting strength in Kenji's pulse. Alina moved with a cold, desperate precision. She didn't have the luxury of a hospital's blood bank or a team of nurses. She had only her rosewood kit and the connection that had started this journey. "I have to do it again," Elena said, her voice dropping to a steady, low tone that brooked no argument. Kenji reached out, his hand grasping hers with what little strength he had left. "No, Elena, you've already given too much. You'll go into shock before the boat reaches the shore." "I am the only match on this boat, Kenji. I am the only match in this world for you right now," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "Your father died to save you, and I am not going to let his sacrifice, or mine, end on this floor." As she set up the direct transfusion line, the cabin became a silent world of two. The engine hummed beneath them, a steady vibration that felt like a shared heartbeat. As her blood began to flow into the tubing once more, Elena felt the world begin to tilt. Her vision blurred at the edges, the slow burn of their romance now physically manifesting as she literally poured herself into him. She began to speak to him, her voice a soft tether keeping him conscious. She told him about her father's laugh, about the dreams she had before the world turned gray, and about the love nest they would build where no one had to hide. She was asking for nothing again, but in the silence of the sea, he was giving her everything. His gaze never left her face, his thumb stroking her hand until the very moment her eyes fluttered shut from the exhaustion of her gift. The sun rose over a private island far from the reach of the city's jagged shadows, painting the sky in hues of soft gold and violet. The air was no longer thick with the scent of antiseptic or the metallic tang of fear. Instead, it was filled with the sweet fragrance of blooming jasmine and the rhythmic lullaby of the turquoise tide. Kenji sat on the wide stone terrace of their villa, a book resting forgotten in his lap as he watched the horizon. He looked stronger than he ever had, the color back in his skin and a newfound peace in his eyes. Beside him, Elena leaned against the railing, her dark curls caught in the sea breeze. The slow burn that had begun in a cold trauma bay had finally settled into a deep, unshakable fire, one that had survived the ultimate test of sacrifice. They were no longer defined by the secrets of the past or the blood they shared. Kenji had walked away from the throne of his criminal empire, leaving the Mafia boss behind to become the man Elena's father had once protected. He had traded his power for a life of quiet devotion, proving that even a giant's heart could be reshaped by a single, selfless act. "What are you thinking about?" Kenji asked, reaching out to pull her onto his lap. His touch was no longer that of a wary hunter. It was the touch of a man who had finally found home. Elena smiled, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong heartbeat that was as much hers as it was his. "I'm thinking that some hearts are worth saving, no matter how broken they seem," she whispered. "And that sometimes the rarest thing in the world isn't a blood type, it's the mercy that lets us start over." As the morning light bathed them both, the love nest was finally complete. They had moved beyond the danger and the debts, finding a sanctuary where they were free to simply be Elena and Kenji, two souls bound by a miracle, looking toward a future they had earned, drop by drop. Kenji and Elena's journey is a powerful reminder that even in a world governed by shadows, a single act of selfless mercy can change the course of history. Their bond was forged in a crisis and sealed with the very blood that kept them both alive. They proved that the strongest debts aren't the ones owed to the underworld, but the ones we owe to our own hearts. If you were moved by Elena's courage and Kenji's transformation, don't let the fire go out here. Hit that like button to show your support for their story, and subscribe to our pack right now to ensure you never miss a heartbeat of our upcoming AMBW journeys. We want to hear from you. If you were in Elena's shoes, would you have risked everything for a stranger before knowing his secrets? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, let us know which city or country you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. We love seeing our community grow across the globe. Thank you for spending these 35 minutes in the nest with us. Look at the videos appearing on your screen right now to dive into another high-stakes romance. Until next time, stay loyal, stay brave, and keep the fire burning.